Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where my guest is Judge Kathleen Richey. She was a juvenile court judge for 24 years, and now she is the state director for Louisiana's Casa organization. What is it? Casa gets volunteers to act as advocates for the most abused and needy and helpless children we have in Louisiana. So join us on the next Legal Lines with Judge Kathleen Richey. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. First of all, I want to thank you for considering our firm for help in handling your legal matter. We know what we're doing. We've been around for a long time. We have over 60 years combined legal experience as lawyers. I've been practicing over 30 years, Sean over 25, and I have paralegals and legal secretaries who've worked for me for over 27 years. We've handled about every kind of case you can handle, and we've been very good at it. The bottom line is, it is our goal to be your protector when necessary, advisor, negotiator, and to successfully conclude the litigation for you in a way that is very favorable. Knowledge is power, and the folks who know what they're doing empower you. They enable you to make the right kind of decisions that best serves you. And that's our number one goal, frankly. Our number one ministry is to serve you. Welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and I'm very pleased to have back on the show Judge Kathleen Richey. She's retired, and she is now working as the director for the state of Louisiana for Casa. Judge, it's great to see you again.
It's good to see you.
Really appreciate you coming in. Well, let's kind of dive in. I'm not sure everybody knows what a Casa organization is or what a Casa worker or volunteer do. Would you please explain it?
CASA stands for Court-Appointed Special Advocates. It is confusing because the name can be confused with some Spanish words, but it is a program that is nationally recognized. It's been around since 1979. The nature of the program is volunteers from the community are specially trained, appointed by a juvenile court judge, and then assigned to advocate for the best interests of children in foster care, for abused and neglected children before the court.
And we'll dive into that, but it's really interesting because you were a juvenile court judge for 24 years, so you know how important these folks are to the court.
Right. Well, in fact, when I ran for judge initially, there was not a CASA program in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, and so one of my goals was to establish a CASA program. So I was on the bench before CASA was established, and then was part of establishing CASA in Baton Rouge. And the Capital Area CASA program is one of the model programs really in the country. It's done an exceptionally good job. And I know how important the CASA volunteer is to good decisions to be made by the juvenile court judge. It's a critical role that impacts children in a really significant way.
And frankly makes daggone, well, as much as humanly can be encouraged, a right decision, because they give you more information as the person who makes the decision.
Well, I always said judges' decisions are only as good as the information they receive.
That's right. And
so the CASA volunteer is involved solely to gather information and make recommendations to the judge in the child's best interest. The parents have an attorney, and their perspective may be different than what is in the best interest of the child. So the CASA volunteer truly operates as the eyes and ears of the judge, what the judge would want to know to make a sound, wholesome decision for a child. Those decisions impact children over the arc of their life, so they are long-lasting, lifetime decisions that judges are making. And I think most of the judges in Louisiana are aware of the significance of those decisions, and they want the best information possible.
And as I indicated earlier, you have poured your life into these scenarios, these children, for decades. So describe the child that we're talking about.
Well, the children who are appointed a CASA volunteer are children who have been, by and large, children who have been removed from their home due to abuse or neglect.
By the state?
By the state. So CASA the national model and the state model is that CASA volunteers are appointed to advocate for children who are before the court due to abuse or neglect. So these are children who've been abused or severely neglected. Most of these children have been removed from their home because a judge has decided that they cannot safely remain with their family. So these are the most vulnerable children in the state.
And in all likelihood, kind of given the process, the legal process, they've been abused for a significant period of time.
Or severely abused once. I mean, the agency, the Department of Children and Family Services, tries to avoid removing children from their own families. So the only time the child is removed is when there is a decision that the child cannot safely stay in their own home. Those decisions have to be confirmed by a judge. The department cannot remove a child from their home without a judge approving it.
So we're talking about the most vulnerable, helpless,
the most severely
victims
hurt.
there are.
Yes.
All right. And so describe the process to the folks of as you sit on a bench for 24 years, how the CASA advocate helped, and then how you've seen it on the other side.
Well, the way the program operates, once the volunteer has been trained, the court appoints the volunteer and the program assigns the case. So say I was a CASA volunteer, I would be appointed by the juvenile court here and I would receive a case. One case, not a caseload of 30 or 40 kids or families. I would have one child. I would get to know the child, I would get to know the facts of the case, I would talk to the child's teacher, I would talk to the child's parents and grandparents, I would talk to the child's foster parents, I would talk to...
All these children are in foster care.
In foster care. I would talk to the child's school teacher, I would talk to maybe even neighbors of the family to find out about the circumstances of the case. What happened that caused this child to be hurt? And after having gathered all that information, I would formulate recommendations for the child to heal and whether or not I felt like this child could go home. And if the child could go home, what would be required for the child to be able to go home. Often we have drugs.
Wow, such an important job.
Well, and the CASA volunteer also reports to the judge about circumstances regarding the child's placement. And I will tell you a story about a case that happened in Baton Rouge. There was a foster parent that I just, from what was presented in court, I thought this foster parent was a wonderful, wonderful foster parent. And this woman wanted to adopt children. And a child was placed there who was freed for adoption and available for adoption because the child's mother had been a drug addict and had just kind of fallen off the radar. No one knew where the mom was. And the CASA volunteer made a surprise visit to this foster home and found that the children were actually being abused by the foster mother. So that information came to me because the CASA volunteer was doing what they needed to do. So obviously I removed the children from this home, and they were later placed in a, they were then placed in another home that did adopt them, and they were doing fine. But had I not had that information from that CASA volunteer, I would have condemned those children to a lifetime of abuse because I would have, based on the information I had, believed this was a good decision for the children to allow them to be adopted by this person who should have never been adopted.
So is there a limitation on the number of children that a foster parent can house and take care of?
DCFS has licensing criteria. So there are processes that a foster parent or someone wanting to be a foster parent have to go through in terms of training, and then there are space requirements, and there are a number of criteria that the foster parent has to meet. But DCFS does not have the manpower to oversee these foster homes as effectively as they need to be. And the CASA volunteer doesn't have the caseload that the state case manager has. The CASA volunteer has one child. They take care of one child, or maybe two if it's a sibling group. And so they are able to put all their energies, all their efforts into doing what's best for this one child. Which makes a significant difference. The child's no longer a number, the child has a voice through the CASA volunteer.
It's almost like they're the responsible parent that maybe's not there all the time, but making sure literally the best interests of the child are in front of you, the judge.
Right. The CASA volunteer is the bridge between the child's needs and the judge's ability to order those needs.
And so what I'd like to tackle in the next segment will be what are the specific training that these CASA volunteers get, and what criteria is there to become one. So we'll talk about that on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. Judge Kathleen Richey. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. First of all, I want to thank you for considering our firm for help in handling your legal matter. We know what we're doing. We've been around for a long time. We have over 60 years combined legal experience as lawyers. I've been practicing over 30 years, Sean over 25, and I have paralegals and legal secretaries who've worked for me for over 27 years. We've handled about every kind of case you can handle, and we've been very good at it. The bottom line is, it is our goal to be your protector when necessary, advisor, negotiator, and to successfully conclude the litigation for you in a way that is very favorable. Knowledge is power, and the folks who know what they're doing empower you. They enable you to make the right kind of decisions that best serves you. And that's our number one goal, frankly. Our number one ministry is to serve you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. Pleased to have back on the show Judge Kathleen Richey. She is the State Director for Louisiana Casa. Judge, let's dive back in. We initially talked on the first segment about the children, who they are and why they're in the system, so to speak, foster care and judges making decisions on their behalf. Let's talk about the Casa volunteers and the staff and what they have, how they train and what they have to do, please.
Well, the CASA programs are staffed. There is a cost to running a CASA program, and there are staff members that oversee the whole process and maintain contact with the court and contact with the volunteers. But the bulk of the work is done by community volunteers. Anyone in the community that wants to volunteer and meets the criteria would then receive training from the CASA program, and would receive, after receiving training and being appointed by the court, the volunteer receives support from the CASA staff, as well as some supervision to ensure that the best interests of the child is served, because sometimes these children's issues can seem overwhelming. So a volunteer needs a supportive staff member helping them make decisions and make recommendations, and the staff is there and is well trained and equipped to assist a volunteer in addressing the needs of the child.
How many staff workers, for example, does the Baton Rouge Casa group have?
I think there are 10 members on staff in Capital Area Casa. Some of the smaller programs have fewer staff, and some of the larger programs have more staff. National Casa Standards requires an advocate supervisor for every 30 volunteers. So for every 30 people in the community that are signed up and working as volunteers, there would be a staff person assigned to them. Additionally, there are staff that are solely responsible for recruiting new volunteers and training the new volunteers. National Casa requires 30 hours of pre-service training. So before you ever are assigned a child, you go through training to make sure that you have the information you need about how the system operates, and about child development, and about the resources available for children to be able to do this work. After that, the advocate supervisor guides and directs the volunteer advocate while the case is going on. But there also needs to do fund development. These are all nonprofit programs, so it's all of the functions of keeping a program going.
So is there special requirements or criteria for the staff member? Are they social workers or anything of that sort, education standpoint? In
accordance with National Casa Standards, it just says that you're qualified to do the job. I think that different programs have different program staff standards.
Got it.
I know that for Louisiana Casa, the state association, you have to have a college degree. It does not have to be in social work, but you have to have some experience in the social work field.
Okay.
So I'm not a social worker.
Right.
My background was law, but it was law in the child welfare
Right.
field. So
I don't think there's anyone more qualified.
So it's a matter of matching the prospective staff member with the need of the program, and each of the programs run their own staffing functions, so I'm not familiar with the requirements that each of the programs has.
So the volunteer calls and sets up an appointment, meets with someone at Casa, and they're interviewed, and
there's a screening process. Most of the programs have specific times during the year when they plan training. So prior to the training, they'll do like an informational session, and anyone interested can come and find out more about that program and about the function of the Casa Volunteer. And if after having that information they are interested in proceeding, they would go through a screening process. You have to be an adult, so you have to be 18. There's no specific educational requirement, but you do have to be able to understand the complexities of the child welfare system. You do have to pass a criminal background check and a child abuse registry clearance, because we want to be sure that the people that we assign to children are not going to hurt the children.
Sure.
And then you have to be in a position to commit a year.
1 year.
These children have a lot of people leave their lives. And we ask, and obviously there can be things that happen that you can't maintain that, but we don't want to mislead anyone. This is
the commitment.
It's rewarding work, but if you're going to help, you need to be in a position to make that commitment. And you need to be able to commit to seeing the child once a month.
And it's one volunteer for one child, unless maybe there's a sibling.
Right. If there's a sibling group that are placed together, then it's generally the volunteer would represent two.
Okay.
But we try real hard to have every child have their own volunteer.
And the volunteer is going to develop a relationship with the child and then try and collect as much information from human sources and other ways.
They also have access to all the child's records, so they can review all the records.
Okay. And then how does the court use them? Do they have a formal role? Do they sit at a legal table, or what do they do?
The court receives a report from the Casa Volunteer.
So they have to write a report?
They write a report.
Is it a daily or per get-together? Or?
The law requires that any reports be turned into the court 10 days and circulated to the other parties 10 days before a hearing. So there are a variety of required hearings under the law, and prior to that hearing, the Casa Volunteer would put together their report, working with their supervisor.
Right.
The supervisor.
That was my next question.
The supervisor helps with the reports, but the content of the report is what is generated by the volunteer from their investigation and from the information that they've received. And they consult with their supervisor regularly to make good recommendations to the court. Those reports are filed with the judge, and the other parties get to read them. Sometimes they can be quite contentious. Sometimes there's a lot of debate over whether or not the recommendation is a sound recommendation. But then the Casa Volunteer is also present during the hearing.
Do they testify? Do they have to defend the report?
Casa is not a party to the proceedings,
okay,
but are available. Everybody has their report, and anybody who wants to challenge what's in the report, or anyone who wants to have more information than is contained in the report, can call the Casa Volunteer as a witness. Often it's the child's attorney that calls the Casa Volunteer as a witness, because the information is sometimes more information than the child's attorney's gotten from anyone else.
Right, I believe that.
The court can call the Casa Volunteer, and often I did, because the information that the Casa Volunteer had been able to unearth was important to the decisions that were needed to be made. And I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to ask questions and get the full picture of what was before the court.
Okay.
So anybody can call you. And sometimes the Casa Volunteer isn't a witness. They're there in the court. I usually made a practice of asking the volunteer during the hearing if there was anything they wanted to add to the report, because a lot can happen with a child in 10 days.
Right.
So you turn in a report, and it could be that it's not nearly what the report reflects by the time you actually get to court. So the information that is gathered by the Casa Volunteer is made available to everybody that's part of the hearing, and there is an opportunity to flesh out that information or challenge the information. The Casa Volunteer is the voice of the child in the courtroom.
All right, and are there monetary resources that are exchanged, or is it strictly a volunteer basis?
It is strictly volunteer.
All right, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith on Legal Lines with my guest, Judge Kathleen Richey. We're talking about Louisiana Casa. Be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. First of all, I want to thank you for considering our firm for help in handling your legal matter. We know what we're doing. We've been around for a long time. We have over 60 years combined legal experience as lawyers. I've been practicing over 30 years, Sean over 25, and I have paralegals and legal secretaries who've worked for me for over 27 years. We've handled about every kind of case you can handle, and we've been very good at it. The bottom line is, it is our goal to be your protector when necessary, advisor, negotiator, and to successfully conclude the litigation for you in a way that is very favorable. Knowledge is power, and the folks who know what they're doing empower you. They enable you to make the right kind of decisions that best serves you. And that's our number one goal, frankly. Our number one ministry is to serve you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. We have our special guest, Judge Kathleen Richey, and she is the state director for Louisiana Casa program. It's a nonprofit organization that provides vital care to children who are the most helpless and abused in our society. Judge, we talked about the kids, we talked about the volunteers. Let's talk about the numbers, which is so sad.
Well, yes, there are, every year there's approximately 8,000 children that are in foster care in Louisiana. And those numbers have held fairly stable over the years. They might dip down to 7,000, whatever, but last year it was 7,900 kids in 2017 that were in foster care. Of those 7,900 kids, there were 4,100 of them that had Casa volunteers. And what you had been asking me is this is all strictly volunteer. The volunteers are not paid any kind of salary. Now, often we'll reimburse travel, but the volunteer work is strictly volunteer work. The costs associated with the program are the costs associated with maintaining the offices for the programs, and we save the state a lot of money.
Let's talk about that, because it's really important for people to understand.
Well, the state calculates that foster care costs about $26,000 a year.
So the state is paying a foster care parent $26,000 to take care of that child per year?
That was the last estimate that I saw. So let's say it's $2,000 a month. National research shows that children with a Casa volunteer spend up to 4 months less time in foster care. So if it's $2,000 a month, we're saving the state $8,000 per child annually. And when you're talking about 7,900 children, you knock that down by $8,000, that's a lot of public money that is spared by the benefit of having a Casa volunteer advocate for the child.
And there's a whole lot of benefits other than just that. The Casa volunteer and the organization not only reduces the length of time in foster care, but a lot of times from what I've read is they're finding resources that the child can access that otherwise aren't going to be accessed.
Right. The research shows that in addition to reducing the amount of time in foster care, that the outcomes are so much better for children with a Casa volunteer. They receive more services than the children who have
We're talking about Medicare,
well, counseling if
food,
they need counseling. When you have somebody whose only interest is making sure that your best interest is served, they will recommend the types of services and the type of help that you need to thrive. So the Casa volunteer is focused on making sure that the children are safe, making sure that they have a permanent home as quickly as possible, and making sure that they have the opportunity to thrive. That's the focus of the Casa volunteer. It's what we do for our own children.
Right, and that's
we
exactly
want to make
what I
sure
was
our
thinking.
children are safe. We want to make sure that they have a permanent safe home, and we
Food
want to
on
make
the
sure
table, medical care,
that they have the opportunity to
education.
thrive. And the research does also show that the educational attainment is higher for the foster child with a Casa volunteer than for the foster child that does not have a Casa volunteer. So the children without Casa volunteers sometimes don't pass grade to grade with the same frequency as children with a Casa volunteer. And I think it's just the fact that these kids have someone in their corner.
And so, sadly, it's great that 50% of the kids have access to a volunteer.
A little more than 50%,
But you know, around 50% do not.
Right.
How does the court decide which children to assign an advocate to?
I think based upon experience and based upon conversation with other judges, most of the judges allow the programs to make the decision as to which child would receive a CASA volunteer and which wouldn't. And so most of the programs assign the child that fits the volunteer the best. For instance, I had a medically involved child in foster care, and there was a nurse who had gone through training and had been sworn in by the judge. So that was a good match between the volunteer and the child's needs. I do know that most of the judges will assign or specifically request CASA volunteers on the more complicated cases, the ones that look like they need a lot of extra help.
Meaning probably are the most abused?
Right, or the most complicated, legally complicated case before the court. Now there are times when you know early on in a case that grandma's going to step up and take the child and they're not going to be involved long. Those cases may not receive a volunteer. So the programs make a concerted effort to appoint the volunteers on the cases with the most significant need. Since we don't have volunteers for everyone, we give the volunteers that we have to the children with the most need.
Okay, let's talk about another stat that's horrible, and that is that what is it, a third to 40% of these children are under age 3?
Yes, of the 7,900 kids in foster care, at least a third of them are under the age of 3. We're talking babies here. I know that when you think of juvenile court, you are often, what comes to mind are the delinquent kids, the 15, 16-year-old out of control kids. That's not the population that the CASA volunteer addresses. The population that the CASA volunteer addresses are the children that have been abused by their parents. And there are lots of sociological reasons for parental child abuse. But what we see, particularly in Baton Rouge, I'm familiar with, but across the state, we have as much neglect, severe neglect, as we have abuse. And children that don't have a safe place to live, children that don't have any supervision and can therefore wander into traffic, children that don't have enough food to eat, children that don't get the appropriate medical care, those are the children that go into foster care. And often they can be sent home if their parents will rehabilitate and be in a posture to keep the child in the home safely. Children only come into foster care when their safety is at risk.
So in your experience, what are the top 3 drivers for parents in this thing? I assume drug, alcohol addiction is probably number 1?
Drug addiction is an undercurrent in all of the neglect cases. Parents don't just neglect their kids out of spite. Most of the neglect cases, you have parents who are involved with drugs or serious alcohol abuse. A lot of mental illness drives child abuse and neglect. And so untreated mental health conditions by parents result in children not being able to be safely parented by their own family. And I think mental health issues also drive for the most part, drive the physical abuse, because we've got significant physical abuse in some cases that the child cannot safely stay in the home. One other dramatic and disheartening statistic is that in 2017 there were 37 children in Louisiana that died because of
under
abuse.
Under 3?
No, they weren't all under 3, but the majority of them were.
And Judge, the way that folks get in touch is a website, phone
well,
number?
you could log on to LouisianaCasa.org and find a program in the area that you live in or that you work in and contact the programs directly, or there's a volunteer tab where you can just sign up to be a volunteer.
And you can donate. Judge, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being back on the show. This is Locke Meredith Legal Lens, Judge Kathleen Richey, the State Director for CASA, Children Advocates, and we need them. Thank you for being with us.